Death and the Cornish Fiddler by Deryn Lake. Side 13. First, I shall get us a glass of cordial each, and then you can tell me everything, Mr. Robinson answered. He rang a bell, and an ancient servant answered and took the order. Now, said the vicar, seating himself opposite John, tell me all you know. Gladly, sir. And John launched into his tale, leaving out nothing, despite the fact that Mr. Robinson lost colour at some of his more lurid descriptions, and once went so far as to put his hands over his ears, his expression one of total disgust. Chapter 25. The story was told, and John, seeing the look of both horror and fear on Mr. Robinson's face, regretted telling it. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "It is rather a ghastly tale." The vicar made an effort to pull himself together. "Well, I'm glad you related it for all that. Now, I don't usually imbibe at this time of day, but I feel on this occasion a small sherry might not come amiss." "I think that sounds like a very good idea," said the apothecary, reviving somewhat. Despite Mr. Robinson's words, 2 large helpings were poured from a decanter standing on a side table. Handing John a glass, the vicar took a seat opposite his. "The point is, my friend, short of doing what you did in Redruth, how do I catch them at it? I think you should involve the constable, sir. After all, those who practice witchcraft are breaking the law of the land, and of God." "Indeed," John replied solemnly. He drank his sherry, and began to feel a great deal better. "Forgive me, but you have lived in Helstone all your life, have you not?" "Yes, indeed. As I have already told you, I was curate here until the Reverend Halsall passed to his rest, when I secured this place for my living." The apothecary looked round him. "You have a fine house here." "Yes, but it is not the vicarage house, which I considered unsuitable." "Oh," said John, longing to ask why, but not daring. As if in answer to his unspoken thoughts, the vicar said, "Mrs. Robinson did not care for the other place, but she liked this house very much." "Oh, I see. How long has she been dead, sir?" 12 years, at least," the vicar replied gloomily. "And you have no children?" It was a natural enough question, but Mr. Robinson looked slightly irritated, and replied, "No, none," rather shortly. John, observing him, wondered why. "Have some more sherry," said the vicar, refilling the apothecary's glass without waiting for a reply. "Thank you, sir. I'll have this, then I really must be getting along. My dear chap, do you feel up to walking back? I'm sure I'll be fine, as long as I can get past the house of my assailant without being attacked. You didn't tell me who it was." "Nicholas Kitto." A very odd expression came over the vicar's face. "That young scoundrel," he said. "I don't know why he behaves so badly. I truly cannot think. Well, don't be too hard on him, sir. I was telling him an unpleasant truth about the love of his life." "The woman I am to bury tomorrow?" "The very same." Mr. Robinson was silent for quite a while, then said, "I knew her, you know." "Did you?" asked John, intensely interested. "Yes. I found her wandering the streets of Truro, and brought her back to Helstone to give her a decent Christian education. But, alas, she caught the eye of a certain noble gentleman, though what the arrangement between them was, I was never quite certain. For Diana, set up by him no doubt, spent some of her time in London, going to theatres and so on. But she always came back here, and when Nicholas was about 17, he met her and fell in love with her." Even while the vicar was saying the words, they were striking the apothecary as odd. For surely Nick had told him that his father, Lord Godolphin, had rescued Diana from Truro. So somebody wasn't telling the truth, and it could not possibly be the reverend gentleman. Or could it? John listened avidly. "What did the noble gentleman do in that situation?" he asked. Mr. Robinson shrugged, quite elegantly for a man of the cloth. "I have no idea. Perhaps she saw them both. Perhaps she dropped the older man for the younger. Who knows?" And John, his head in a whirl, thoroughly agreed with the last statement. For why should Nick tell him a tissue of lies unless it was to protect someone? But it was no use bombarding the vicar with questions. The apothecary decided to change the subject. "Are you expecting a large number at the funeral, sir?" he asked. "A mere handful, if we're lucky," came the rather sad reply. "Well, I shall be there," said John, rising somewhat shakily to his feet. "My dear boy, allow me to walk with you." And Mr. Robinson stood up too. True to his word, the vicar escorted John up the street, then on to the Angel. There was no sign of Nick Kitto anywhere, and the apothecary rather imagined that his mother must be holding him under lock and key. If it hadn't been for the aching in his head, he almost could feel sorry for the wretched young man. "Well, good afternoon, my friend. I shall see you tomorrow." "You will indeed," answered the apothecary, as he and Mr. Robinson bowed to each other and parted company. A far bigger crowd turned up than John or the vicar had anticipated. Mrs. Pill, accompanied by her brother and the entire retinue of servants, came. There was Lord Godolphin and Nicholas Kitto, of course. Tim Painter arrived a few minutes after Catherine, sitting in a different pew and smiling amiably at the world. These people, together with the landlord of the Angel and several of the regulars, made quite a goodly collection, John thought, as he made his way to his customary place at the back of the church, where he could observe everyone, but not be seen himself. Mr. Robinson, rather pale, his blue eyes like glinting sapphires in his face, began the customary funeral oration. Today his voice seemed weak, and he cleared his throat several times until he finally got a grip on himself and began to speak in normal tones. John thought over the story he had heard of the vicar saving Diana from begging on the streets of Truro. Then the other tale of Nicholas Kitto's father doing exactly the self-same thing. Lord Godolphin was sitting almost directly in front of him, dressed to the inch, his face emotionless. In fact, it looked almost deliberately blank, as if the man were trying to disguise what he was feeling. Across the way from him was Tim Painter, no longer grinning, but managing for once to appear quite serious. John stole a look at Mrs. Pill, who seemed bowed with grief, her head in her hands, as people rose to sing a hymn. All in all, the apothecary supposed they were pretty typical of a bunch of people attending a funeral. And yet there was something wrong, as if everyone were playing a part, trying to appear something that they were not. The service came to an end, and it was time for the committal to earth. 6 burly village lads carried the coffin in the absence of male relatives, while the vicar led the way to the graveside, walking slowly and sorrowfully. John followed the rest of the doleful procession, trailing along behind. Mrs. Pill was leaning heavily on Jasper's arm, weeping copiously and staggering slightly as she threw in the obligatory handful of earth. Lord Godolphin cast a large portion, but Nick Kitto, by now in floods of tears, threw in a red rose and glared defiantly out of moist eyes at the rest of the company. Tim Painter, looking quite shaken, emptied some earth from stiff fingers, while John Rawlings passed by, never sympathizing with the ceremony and not feeling moved to do so on this occasion. The dismal walk from the graveyard to the church began. The apothecary, proceeding alone, felt a tug at his elbow and saw that a shamefaced Nick Kitto had joined him. "I'm sorry I attacked you, sir, and I hope I did no damage." The apothecary smiled as best his damaged lip allowed. Other than for giving me a thundering headache, no harm done." "I wanted to ask you," Nick started, but there his voice was drowned by a much louder sound. From beyond the church came the noise of a band playing a funeral march at full volume, above the rest of the cacophony rising the sweet, sad voice of a violin. He knew, even without seeing who had gathered there, that the blind fiddler had heard of Diana's funeral and had come to pay his respects. He turned to Nicholas. "The gaffer is here with his band. Now I beg you to restrain yourself. Ask him questions by all means, but pray do so in a civilized manner." But young Kitto had already broken into a run and was heading along the path that went round to the front of the church. John, following at a slightly more leisurely pace, concluded that the young man had quite literally gone mad with love. But when he got round the corner, he saw that even wild Nick had been halted by the sheer sobbing beauty of the fiddler's music. The rest of the band were playing softly beneath the soaring notes of the violin, which seemed to be offering a prayer direct to God, far more effectively than those just said in the church, the apothecary thought. The rest of the funeral party, coming up from the graveside, were also stopped by the sight of the blind fiddler. In fact, everyone stood in silence until the air was concluded, when one or two people burst into spontaneous applause. The gaffer lowered his bow and turned his head. "I hear we have company, lads." "Yes, sir," said Gideon. "It's the funeral party." The blind man took a step towards them. "How-de-do, ladies and gentlemen. I've come to pay my respects to Diana Warwick." At that, Nicholas broke ranks. "What did you mean by going into her bedroom in the small hours? It was me who found her dead, not you." There was a stunned silence, broken by the fiddler saying, "I knew Miss Warwick when you were still a twinkle in your father's eye, young man, and I felt free enough with her to visit her in her room at any time I pleased." Nicholas literally ran towards him, fists raised. "I'll have you for that." "No, you won't," the gaffer responded, and sidestepped so adroitly that Nick fell flat on his face in the churchyard. The apothecary could not resist it. He chuckled under his breath. The fiddler looked over in the direction of the sound. "Mr. Rawlings, is it?" John stepped up to him. "Yes, it's me." "I thought I recognized that laugh." "So you've concluded your business in Redruth?" "Aye, 'tis all done." "Is yours?" "Yes," John answered briefly, his attention drawn by the fact that Lord Godolphin had gone to assist Nicholas Kitto and was helping him to stand upright. The gaffer put a hand on John's arm. "There's dark doings there, my friend." John could only whisper, "I know," before the figure of Nick charged up once more. "You dirty blackguard," he said. The blind fiddler turned on him. "No, sir, that I am not. In fact, I've probably done more honourable things in my life than you can conceive of. Now you listen to me, young sir. The woman whom you have just seen buried was a great friend of mine. She was also a whore. If you can't accept that, if you want to put her on a pedestal, then that is entirely your choice. But one day, reality will creep in, and you must accept her for what she was. Until that happens, I bid you good afternoon, and I take my leave of you. Goodbye, Mr. Kitto." The unexpected happened then. Nick collapsed into a sobbing heap on the breast of the blind fiddler, who held him as tenderly and tightly as if he had been a wayward son coming home to learn a lesson at the hands of his father. John stared, amazed. "You're very patient," he said, somewhat daunted, to the gaffer. "Aye, sir. I've learned how to be." And with that, the fiddler passed the boy gently to the vicar, who had approached meanwhile, and putting his bow to the strings, started to play a wonderful and soul-stirring lament. There was no wake, as such, though several of them, including the gaffer and his band, got together in the parlour of the Angel. The vicar, who had joined them, particularly, or so it seemed, to keep an eye on Nick, took a little sherry, but the fiddler's men drank ale by the pint, then burst into spontaneous playing, so much so that other people wandered in to listen. Lord Godolphin, who surprisingly had graciously attended for a half-hour, took his leave at that point, bidding his fellow mourners farewell. John, observing him closely, found himself puzzling more and more as to whether he was the natural father of Nicholas or not, because ever since that extraordinary embrace in the churchyard, he was wondering if the blind fiddler could possibly be the man. Yet a conversation with his lordship regarding Mrs. Warwick was essential. As Lord Godolphin left the room, John slipped out also. He caught up with him in the street, waiting for his carriage to come round. "Excuse me, my lord," he said politely. "Would it be possible to have a word with you?" "By all means. When did you have in mind?" "Now, if that would be convenient. My carriage is about to take me home. May I ride with you? I can find my own way back." "Yes, it will help pass the journey, if nothing else." Wondering exactly how he was going to handle this somewhat supercilious being, John clambered aboard, taking a seat opposite that of his lordship. He decided to pander to the man's vanity. "It was very kind of you to see me at such short notice, my lord." Lord Godolphin waved a deprecating hand. "Think nothing of it. Now, what was it you wanted to talk to me about?" "The woman whose funeral we have just attended." "Miss Warwick? What about her?" "How well did you know her, sir?" Milord's face became a study in careless insouciance. "I remember now that I knew her. Something I did not recall when last we spoke of her. She came here when she was a young girl. I believe she was rescued by the present vicar before he was promoted to the post." "Rescued? From what?" John asked innocently. "Oh, God knows. One of those things that men of the church are concerned about. She lived in Helstone for a while." Lord Godolphin's voice became suddenly warm. "She was such a beautiful creature, you know." "I suppose a great many people were in love with her," John said quietly. "The future vicar, certainly, and one or two others beside." "The vicar?" the apothecary repeated in astonishment. "Oh, yes, it was perfectly obvious. His wife was alive then, a sickly creature. Robinson worshipped the ground the girl walked on." "And you?" The words were out before John Rawlings had time to control them, and he instantly regretted what he had just said. Lord Godolphin gave him a steely glance and looked out of the window. When he turned back, John saw that he was smiling. "I was young and foolish, and I adored beautiful things. Yes, I admit it. I fell in love with her as well." The apothecary knew the rest of the story and felt no need to pursue the matter. But there was one thing he desperately needed to find out. He leant forward, his expression earnest. "Sir, you can throw me out of the coach on the instant, but there is one further question I have to ask." "Yes?" "Did you visit Miss Warwick on the night she was murdered? And was she alive when you did so?" His lordship looked down the length of his aristocratic nose. "What right have you to ask those questions of me?" "None at all, sir." "You're an impudent rogue, sir." "Indeed I am, my lord. But the question is burning at my soul." "I suppose you have a witness who saw me?" John nodded mutely. "Well, the answer, my friend, is yes to both. Diana was alive when I went to see her. Are you satisfied?" John nodded. "I certainly am. Thank you, my lord." "And now you can get out of the coach. The walk back should put some colour in your cheeks. You're looking terrible, by the way. Have you been in some sort of accident?" The apothecary grinned painfully as Lord Godolphin banged on the ceiling with his stick and shouted instructions to the coachman. "It would be fair to say that I have, sir. Good day to you." Chapter 26. When John returned to Helstone after walking briskly for an hour, he found that at last the postboy had delivered the long-awaited letter from Sir John Fielding. It read as follows: "My dear friend, Mr. Rawlings, what you say to me gives me cause for concern. I had imagined you taking your ease in Devon, but I read that instead you are involved in a series of strange events. Take my advice, and do not confuse one with the other, for it seems to me that two separate hands are at work. I would send you the assistance of two brave fellows, but alas, all are out about their business. I fear for the child, but fear more the murderer of the woman. At this distance, I can offer no further advice, but I do caution you to be careful. Your very respectful servant, J. Fielding." It was rather disappointing, John thought, giving no real advice, but offering instead a warning. He had rather hoped that in consulting Sir John he might be given some assistance, but even this was to be denied him. He must hunt for the murderer of Diana alone. And then, as he sat deep in thought, an idea occurred to him that began to take root in his mind and refused to go away. So he missed the hour to dine and continued to brood over his latest notion until the shadows began to lengthen. He awoke next morning feeling refreshed and went down to breakfast ravenously hungry. There was no one about, and John was able to catch up with a local newspaper. Having read it through, however, he put it down and gazed into space, deciding on his plan of action. If the idea which had seized him so strongly on the previous evening was correct, he needed to act fairly swiftly. The question was how, exactly. In order to clear his mind, the apothecary decided to go for a ride. Walking round to the livery stable, he hired the most docile creature they had available, a patient-looking roan that plodded towards him when fetched from its loose box, and proceeded out of Helstone, away from the sea and up the hill. Panting and gasping, his horse, which had the whimsical name of Rajah, gained the top and refused to move another step. Feeling sorry for it, John dismounted and led it into the shade, where it started to chew grass in a ruminative fashion. Sitting on a fallen tree trunk, John stared about him at the rolling and challenging landscape. He could see for miles, having a bird's-eye view. From this point, the town of Helstone looked small and unimportant, yet contained within its heart was at least one murderer, and probably more if his theories about Isabel were correct. The apothecary's attention was suddenly drawn to a small coach coming in on the road from Redruth. He stared at it fixedly, wishing he had brought his telescope. Sure that he recognized it, he remounted the now refreshed Rajah and proceeded downhill in the general direction of the road. As he drew nearer, he was convinced he was right, and called out, "Jed, stop! It's me, John Rawlings." He saw the coachman look round, and then pull the horses to a halt. Rather as he thought would happen, Elizabeth's head, gorgeously hatted, was thrust out of the window. She was just about to ask what was happening when she saw him. "John!" He swept the covering from his head and bowed from the saddle. "Madame Marchesa." "I didn't expect to see you, not yet at least." "Nor I you, madam. What brings about your early return?" In her usual frank manner she answered, "Your child is not happy without you, it seems. She is a dear soul, but she craves your company." He was half pleased and half saddened. He longed for Rose to be independent, but on the other hand fully appreciated the fact that the poor child had been left motherless and probably clung to him more than was customary. At that moment the little imp, grinning and hatless, thrust her head out above Elizabeth's. "I'm sorry, Papa." "Don't be. I'm delighted to see you." "And I you, sir," she responded bravely, and his heart went out to her. He rode behind the coach, which rattled over the cobbled streets of Helstone till they came to the main thoroughfare, and finally pulled to a stop in front of the Angel. Elizabeth dismounted, leaving the child to the mercies of Rufus, riding shotgun once more. She turned to the apothecary with a smile. "My dear, I'm going to disappoint you. I am leaving you as soon as I have refreshed myself." He could only stare, certain that she too had been coming back to join him. "I have much to do at home," Elizabeth continued, smiling even more delightfully, "and I really need time to concentrate on it on my own." John immediately felt guilty. "Rose, was she too much for you?" "Not at all. She's a joy to have around the place, and is most popular with the staff, I can assure you. But it is just that I need time to myself. Do you understand?" "Of course," he answered. But inside he felt disappointed. Disappointed that the Marchesa was returning his daughter to him and had found it impossible to be a mother to her. Disappointed, too, that his love for her was, now clearly, doomed to fade away. However, he hoped that he was showing none of this, continuing to smile as she went on speaking. "I knew you would. So, my dear, let us have some coffee together before I depart." "Of course. I'll order some immediately." He took Rose's hand, looking down at her with much affection. "So you missed me, did you?" She stared back up at him, and for a minute, despite her red colouring and general aspect, Emilia peeped out. Seeing that, John felt suddenly totally depressed with everything, but particularly with the development of this enquiry. He was swimming through molasses, and every stroke he took was making things worse. He made an instant decision to reveal none of this to Elizabeth, however hard she pressed him. No sooner were they seated at a table, Rose happily sitting beside her father, than the Marchesa turned to him. "Tell me, my dear, how is everything going?" "Extremely well," John answered overconfidently. "Have Mrs. Pill's party found Isabel?" "No, and I don't think they ever will. I reckon she's a victim of low pool." "And what about the murderer of Diana Warwick? Are you any further forward?" "As a matter of fact, I am," said John, and meant it. "I see. What do you intend to do about it?" "I shall go to the constable, of course." Elizabeth shot him a look full of unexpressed thoughts. "You enjoy all this," she said eventually. "You know I do," he answered shortly, then deliberately changed the subject. "May I call on you before I return to London?" "But of course. I would be deeply wounded if you did not do so." "But I am the one who is wounded," he thought. "Your whole attitude to me and my daughter has hurt me immeasurably." Yet deep down, he knew that it was his pride that was damaged rather than anything else. "Then I shall," he said, and stood up. "If you will forgive me, madam, Rose and I must visit the constable and make a report." She looked frankly surprised, much to John's delight. "Well, I suppose this is goodbye." "For the present," he replied stiffly, and kissed her hand. Rose rather spoiled things by flinging her arms round the Marchesa's neck and embracing her warmly on the cheek. "Thank you for looking after me, Mrs. Elizabeth. It's been a pleasure, sweetheart. Come and see me soon." "I shall come with Papa," the child answered, and put her hand into John's. It hadn't been a very dignified exit, John thought, as he walked to William Trethowan's place of employment. He had left the Marchesa sitting alone, staring at him with a somewhat bemused expression on her face, as he and his daughter had set off purposefully. "And that's the way I'll treat her in future," John muttered angrily. "What did you say, Father?" Rose piped up. Nothing, sweetheart. Tell me, was Mrs. Elizabeth kind to you when you stayed with her?" "Very. She's really nice." "Are you going to marry her?" "Most certainly not," he replied forcefully, and strode forward. He discovered the constable at work, and found himself considering that there must be little crime in Helstone, otherwise the man would be far busier about his duties. Trethowan put down his hammer and wiped his brow. "Good afternoon, Mr. Rawlings. What can I do for 'ee?" "Quite a good deal." John turned to Rose. "Look, darling, at the old cat over there. She's had a litter of kittens. Go and have a closer inspection." With his daughter out of earshot, the apothecary rapidly described all that had taken place in Redruth, watching the constable's face as he did so. The man's expression became more and more horror-struck as he listened. Eventually he spoke. "I know Lord Lyle's place up by Low Pool. I shall make it my business to call there. Don't go alone, I warn you. I wondered if you might come with me, sir." "Provided we take some more men, the answer is yes. But I've got something else to tell you about the death of Miss Warwick." And John put forward the theory he had been considering the night before. William's face fell as he listened. "It's a good conjecture, all right. But how to prove it, that's the question. I can't very well go and accuse the person concerned, but there are ways of eliciting the information. You would be better at those than I would, sir." John gave a resigned sigh. "You want me to find out for you?" "If you would, Mr. Rawlings, I would deem it a personal favour." Rose was heading towards them holding a kitten. Once again, John was vividly reminded of Amelia, who had had a weakness for all animals. "Oh, Papa, isn't it sweet?" "It would not be possible for us to adopt it, Rose," John said firmly, cutting to the heart of the matter. She pulled an adorable face, quite deliberately. "But—" "No buts. The answer is no." "Oh, Papa—" William Trethowin bent down. "Don't worry, little maid. The mother cat lives in the yard. The little uns can stay with her till they be bigger." "Can I come and visit every day?" "Well, that depends on your papa." John gave a crooked grin. "We'll come as often as we can, Rose. Will that do?" "Oh, very well," she answered, and kicked a stone, though only slightly. Somewhat amused by this tiny show of temperament, the apothecary took his daughter firmly by the hand and led her away. Having called at the Angel to check that Elizabeth had departed, which he was somewhat glad to see she had, John returned to the livery stables and rehired the aged horse, together with a small, resolute pony for Rose. Then he rode with her at a circumspect pace, heading down Coinage Hall Street to the open countryside surrounding Low Pool. There, saying nothing to his daughter, he ambled round the waterway's circumference, looking at the various dwellings built overlooking it. He spotted Lord Lyle's house almost straight away. Set up high and surrounded by trees, it looked a grand residence even in the distance. "Why are you looking at that house?" Rose asked. "I know the man who owns it." "Is he nice?" "No, not at all," John answered, remembering their last meeting and how he had finally managed to bluff his way out. "Oh dear," she said, but got no further, for from behind them John could hear the pounding of hooves. Instinctively he put out his hand and took the pony's rein and led Rose into the shelter of the trees. Peering through the leaves, he sat silently, motioning his daughter to do likewise. A man was coming hell for leather along the track, clearly an excellent rider. John had a moment of envy before he recognized the fellow as Lord Lyle. It was surprising to see him alone, but his destination was obvious. Where the lane divided, he took the left-hand fork uphill and started the climb to the house that John had been watching. So, his lordship had returned to his home in Helstone. The apothecary thought rapidly. He had managed to talk his way out of trouble when he had last seen the man. But what of the 7? The 3 women and 4 men involved in witchcraft? He had played cards with the satanic ladies, and they had known perfectly well that he was in Redruth, but none of them had seen him at the ruined abbey. Could he continue the pretense of merely being an innocent visitor? It was worth trying, he decided. End of Side 13. Side 14. "Was that the wicked man?" asked Rose. "Yes, sweetheart, that was him." "Can we come out of hiding now?" He's gone, so yes, we can. As they trotted into the late May sunshine, John's daughter said, "I enjoyed that." "What?" "Hiding. It was exciting." The apothecary looked at her in amazement. Most children would have been afraid of suddenly being told to take cover in the trees, might even have burst into tears. But not Rose. She was truly his daughter, a daughter to be proud of. With the thought of having many years to watch her grow and develop, John Rawlings burst into song as he continued his ride round Low Pool. With Elizabeth gone, he was naturally going to find the evenings more difficult to organise. Having given the thumb-sucking little maid a handsome tip to check on Rose every half hour once the child had retired for the night, John made his way to the tap-room. There, sitting looking somewhat doleful, was his erstwhile travelling companion, Tim Painter. "Ah, my dear friend, how goes it?" the apothecary enquired cheerfully. "We're leaving tomorrow," Tim responded gloomily. "Are you now?" John answered. He had been half expecting the reply, yet still it came as something of a shock. "How have you persuaded Mrs. Pill to go?" he added. "She has finally given up hope." "She has accepted the fact that Isabel is dead?" Tim nodded silently. "I'd like to see her before she leaves," John said. "She's dining late with her beastly brother." "How are you going to live like that in future? The man clearly detests you." Tim turned his handsome eyes in the apothecary's direction. "Not as much as I detest him. But to answer your question, who knows what lies ahead?" John looked at him with shrewd amusement. "What are you saying to me?" "Just that. Catherine and I are together for the moment." John could not help but laugh. "Are you saying that if something better were to present itself, then you would be off? Have you no shame, sir?" "None at all, I'm delighted to say. But surely the poor woman has done a great deal for you." "And so have I for her," Tim protested. "After all, she was pretty short of suitors after the death of old man Pill. Then I came along." "Oh, happy chance," said the apothecary, and raised a dark eyebrow. Still, the thought of their imminent departure left him with a great deal to do. Plunging his face into his wineglass, John thought rapidly. The blind fiddler was still in town, as was Lord Godolphin. Nick Kitto was sulking miserably in his home, but was easily reachable. Tim Painter was currently sitting beside him. John thought frantically of some excuse to get them all together, but came up with nothing. Then Tim said, nonchalantly, "Fancy a game of cards?" "Why not?" John answered. Then he said, "Shall I go and find some more who'd like to play?" Tim looked surprised. "Yes, if you can raise anyone. It would be amusing to gamble the night away. I'll see who I can discover. Listen, I shall have to leave for a short while. Can you listen out for my daughter? She's fast asleep, but it is possible she could wake up." A foxy grin crossed Tim's face. "Not so easy without your light o' love, is it?" "No," John answered with feeling. "It's not so easy." Chapter 27. Walking purposefully, the apothecary went up the road, then down Church Street, all the time turning over in his mind the names of the men who had visited Diana Warwick on the night she had been killed. Indeed, he was just conjecturing what excuse he could possibly use to lure Lord Godolphin to play cards with a handful of ordinary citizens, when, as good fortune would have it, he saw the man leaving the doctor's house. Sprinting to catch up before his lordship got into his coach, John arrived panting and gasping just as Lord Godolphin put his foot on the step. Turning, he saw the apothecary. "Oh, it's you," he said. "Yes, sir. How are you?" John answered, not being able to think of anything else to say. "My damnable gout is playing up again. Not that it's any business of yours, mark you." Putting on his honest citizen face, the apothecary gave him a sincere look. "Oh, but it is my business, sir. I prescribed a remedy for you. I hope it worked." "It worked well enough, thank you. But, as you will be leaving us soon, I have returned to my doctor." "I have enjoyed meeting you, sir. In fact, it has been one of the highlights of my trip." John was getting desperate, and thought that the only thing he could do was to act like a sycophant, much as it went against the grain. "I'm delighted to hear it. Now, if you'll excuse me—" "I will excuse you, sir, but first I must ask you a favour, an enormous favour." "Would you allow me to buy you a drink in the Angel?" His lordship heaved himself up into his coach, leaving John in the undignified position of leaning in through the conveyance's door. "Just a little drink," continued the apothecary sweetly, thinking he was about to be sick. The words were sticking in his mouth so badly. "Oh, very well. I shall see you there in a quarter of an hour. I have another call to make first. I am your servant, my lord." And John bowed low. The minute the coach had drawn away, however, he straightened up and removed the sickly grin from his face. Adopting a much more determined expression, he headed straight for the home of Nicholas Kitto. An ancient retainer answered the door this time, and was still asking John who he wanted to see, when Nick himself came into the hall. "Oh, it's you," he said, using identical words to Lord Godolphin. "Yes, as you see," John answered. He held out his hand. "Nicholas, let our quarrel be at an end, for pity's sake, and for mine. I've come to invite you to have a drink with me, and maybe play cards. It will do you good to get out." Nick turned a morose face in his direction. "I feel at the moment that I wouldn't care if I never ventured forth again. Well, I'd be obliged if you could make an effort tonight. I shall be off in the next few days, and would like to think that we parted on good terms." Nick shuffled from foot to foot, then looked up. John knew at once that the fellow was desperate to leave the house, and was longing for an excuse. "I'll have to think about it," he said slowly. The apothecary put on his no-nonsense face. "I'm afraid that won't do, my friend. You'll oblige me and say yes immediately. I'm determined to have a little gathering before my departure. Lord Godolphin will be there," he added. "Oh, very well then," said Nicholas, quite promptly. "Good. Then I'll meet you at the Angel in quarter of an hour. There's just one other person I want to invite to my party. I'll bid you farewell." And with that, he had turned on his heel and hurried back up the street before Nick could change his mind. He found the band in the Blue Anchor, playing, as was their wont, to please the other customers, and at the same time make a few pennies to pay for drinks. The sound was a great deal noisier and more cheerful than the one they had made at the funeral. Without hesitation, John went straight up to the gaffer as soon as they had finished the rendition of their jolly air. "My dear sir," he said, "we meet again." "Mr. Rawlings, isn't it?" asked the Cornish Fiddler, with that strange perception that blind people seem to have. "The very same." John bowed, and the gaffer did likewise. "What can I do for 'ee, sir?" "You can come and play at a little gathering I'm organizing at the Angel." "When, sir?" "In 10 minutes or so." "That's very short notice, sir." "Now, will you be wanting all of us, or is it just me?" "I thought just you." John leant closer and whispered in his ear, surrounded as it was by black locks and swarthy beard. "Oh, I see," said the gaffer, when the apothecary was done. "It's a sprat to catch a mackerel, is it?" "I hope so. But then, who can tell? Nothing may come out at all." The blind fiddler turned towards John, just as if he could see. "You're a wise young man, Mr. Rawlings. Has anyone ever told you that?" "There have been one or two in the past, yes." "So there should have been." The gaffer turned to his band. "Listen, lads, I'll be leaving you for a while. I'm going to play at a little gathering of gentlemen up at the Angel. You stay here and entertain the folk, right? Are you getting paid, gaffer?" I'm getting well rewarded, never fear." And the Cornish Fiddler winked an unseen eye at the apothecary. Lord Godolphin was alighting from his coach as John and the gaffer made their way arm in arm up to the hostelry door. His lordship raised his quizzing glass. "Oh, it's you, my good man. I wondered who could be perambulating up the street in that odd manner." "Yes, it's me, sir," John answered. "The fiddler is coming to play for us while we drink and play cards." "Cards, is it? You didn't tell me that." "Would you be so kind as to make up the fourth, my lord?" "I don't see why not," Lord Godolphin answered jovially, and John suspected that the man might have a weakness for gambling. Hurrying into the tap-room, where Nick had now joined Tim Painter, John ushered the men into one of the snugs and took over the one and only table. Seeing a card party setting up, the other occupants left the room, thus giving them the privacy they needed. Standing a little apart, the blind fiddler started to play, very softly. John handed the cards to Lord Godolphin and asked him to deal. "Shall we play whist, gentlemen?" "Certainly," replied Nick, and there were noises of assent from the others. Wondering how he was going to broach the subject of Diana Warwick and the night on which she died, John, a bad card player at the best of times, could scarcely concentrate on his hand. It was clear from the outset that Tim and his lordship were both exceptionally good players, however, and soon the apothecary and young Kitto found themselves hopelessly outclassed. Tim executed a Bath coup, which Lord Godolphin countered, thus winning the rubber. There was a general exclamation, and they paused to recharge their glasses. "Gentlemen," John began, "I had a motive in inviting you all here tonight. It was—" But he got no further. There was the sound of pounding feet coming along the corridor, then the door burst open. Framed in the entrance was the figure of William Trethowin, the constable. "Mr. Rawlings," he panted, out of breath, "can you come at once? There's a ritual going on close by Low Pool." John leapt to his feet, while the others turned startled faces in the direction of the speaker. "It's a witch's coven," the apothecary said by way of explanation. "I came across them in Redruth, and now they've obviously made their way here." "I'll come to Low Pool with you," Tim stated, without hesitation. "Me too," said Nick Kitto, rising. "I may as well join you all," Lord Godolphin remarked majestically. "There's no time to waste." This from Trethowin. "We must catch them in the act, and then I can charge and arrest them." "I'll call for my coach," said his lordship. But the others had already left, running behind the constable down Coinage Hall Street to the countryside beyond. "I'm glad there's a few of you, sir," William remarked, as he sped down the road beside the apothecary. "Are there a lot of them, then?" "About 20, I think. I didn't have time to count exactly." "You're going to need all the help you can get in that case." "I've a few men hidden up there, but not nearly enough." They had left the little town behind them, and were making their way through the open land towards the pool, following the course of the River Cober. Faintly, borne on the breeze, could be detected the sound of chanting. Beside him, John felt Nick stiffen. "Can you hear that?" "It's them, all right," Tim answered him meaningfully. Avoiding the marshland and bearing to the left, they could see the glint of water through the trees. And there, up on the hill, shaded from Penrose House by parkland, but standing almost immediately opposite it, was the dwelling belonging to Lord Lisle. "The ritual is taking place in the woods," whispered the constable, pointing. "Did you see it?" asked John. "I climbed up a little way. There's some old ruins in the grounds. It's being held inside them." "Like Redruth," the apothecary answered grimly. They had reached the fork in the road and began the ascent to the house. Wondering where Lord Godolphin had got to, John climbed upward. The sound of the chanting was growing louder, blotting out the distant voice of the sea, and he was filled with a sense of unreasonable terror. Glad to have stout companions, he continued the march uphill, and then panic broke out. There was a scream from one of the constable's assistants, who began to run downwards as fast as the others were coming up. Breaking through their ranks, he bellowed, "He's after me! Oh, God help me! He's after me!" Chaos broke out. The 4 men ascending, namely the constable, John, Tim Painter and Nick, stood their ground, but the other fellows, ordinary men of Helstone who had been dragooned into helping Trethowan, broke ranks and started to scurry downwards. "Stop!" bellowed the constable, but to no avail. The volunteers, thoroughly frightened, were heading off as fast as they could go in the direction of town. John turned to Trethowan. "What shall we do?" "There are just the 4 of us, sir. We won't have a hope against that lot." "You're right," said Tim Painter promptly. "Let's return and have some claret." "And make a plan," said Nick. "Yes," answered John, relieved in a way. "I think it would be best if we got out of here." It appeared that Lord Godolphin had started off in pursuit of his card-playing friends, and had then lost a coach wheel at the bottom of Coinage Hall Street. Indeed, it was being repaired as the quartet made their way back to the Angel. It was clear that his lordship had given up the chase early in the day, and had made his way back to the snug, where he had sunk a bottle of wine without any difficulty whatsoever. He looked up as the others came in. "Tally-ho, gentlemen! Did you track down the wrongdoers?" "No, sir," answered Trethowan, suddenly very formal. "There was a commotion at the other end, and my assistants ran away. We had no option but to follow." "A commotion, eh? What was all that about?" "I questioned one of 'em on the way back, and he said he saw the ghost of Parson Jago mounted on horseback." "Parson Jago?" interrupted John, for the clerk of Bow Street Court was also called Jago, an old friend of the apothecary's. "We've had several parsons of that name hereabouts, and there's a legend that one of them could exorcise ghosts, and to this day can still be seen mounted on his mare," answered his lordship. "What a strange coincidence!" And John related the story of his acquaintanceship with the clerk. "Jago is a Cornish name," said Nick Kitto. "It means James." "Well, well, I never knew that. You must ask him whether he comes from these parts." "I will indeed." "I thought we were going to make a plan, gentlemen," said the constable plaintively. "I'll give you a plan," said Lord Godolphin, thumping the table with his fist. "I'll call on Lyle tomorrow and ask what the devil he's playing at. Forgive me, sir, but I think that would be dangerous," said Trethowan seriously. "Damn foolhardy," put in Tim, who had taken a seat and been pouring himself glasses of claret with great enthusiasm. "Then what shall we do?" "I think we should raid the house in force and look for evidence." "You won't find any," John replied. "They're too clever for that." "Then, sir, what do you suggest?" "We've got to catch them at it. In fact, we missed a great opportunity tonight. I wonder what it was your man saw, by the way." "Perhaps he truly saw Parson Jago. Perhaps the ritual conjured him up." "You can't believe such superstitious nonsense." Lord Godolphin spoke. "Cornwall is alive with legends and ghost stories. They're as old as time. You would do well to mark them, Rawlings." The laugh that John had been about to give froze on his lips when he saw the serious expressions of both his lordship and William Trethowan, and he thought again of Gipsy Orchard. "I'll try my hardest, sir," he answered contritely. "Well, I'd best be getting back. I'll consult with you in the morning, gentlemen." "Excellent plan," said Tim, pouring himself another glass. "If I say I'm on special duties, I might be able to delay my departure." "I leave that to you, sir. Good night." And Trethowan made to go out, but was interrupted by the thumb-sucking maid. "Oh, sir," she said to John, "your little girl is awake, and she's frightened." The apothecary cursed himself. In the excitement of the dash to the low, he had forgotten entirely that Rose had returned and was lying asleep upstairs. Before anyone could question him, he had left the room and gone up the flight 2 at a time. He could hear her crying quietly before he even opened the door. "Oh, Papa!" she said, as soon as she saw him, and she jumped out of bed and hurled herself into his arms. There, sweetheart. There's no need to be afraid. I'm here." "But it was so horrid, Father." "What was, darling?" "My door opened, and a woman stood there, and... oh, Papa!" Rose wept again. "What, dearest? What did she do?" "She beckoned for me to go with her, but I was too afraid, and I told her to go away." "What happened then?" "She just laughed, and said that she would be back, and..." "Yes?" "that she would take me to join Isabel." Chapter 28. That night the apothecary slept badly, dreaming vivid dreams of Emilia, in which she begged him to take care of her child. Waking up in a sweat, seeing from his travelling carriage clock that it was 2 in the morning, he gazed to where Rose slept peacefully. He had moved himself into her room after she had told him the story of the old woman who had beckoned her, certain, though he had said nothing to the child herself, that the female had been a member of that ghastly coven of witches. Then, during the night, a terrible thought had occurred to him. If one supposed that they were into human sacrifice, could that have been the fate of Isabel Pill? Had she, after all, met her end on some unconsecrated altar, and her defenceless body been disposed of afterwards? It was a hideous idea, and yet, the more John considered it, the more sense it made. He sat bolt upright in his makeshift bed, perspiration starting out all over his body, his hand reaching for a glass of water. A shaft of moonlight was shining in through the curtains, which had not been properly drawn, and getting out of bed, the apothecary silently crossed to the window and looked out. Helstone slept, apparently at rest, yet John was more than aware that beneath its blameless facade there currently dwelt a band of people with evil in their hearts. Looking back over his shoulder, he saw that his child still slumbered, and at that moment determined that he would never leave her alone again until he had departed from that Cornish town forever. Which shouldn't be long, he thought to himself. In fact, he had only one task remaining before he and Rose could return to Devon. And this idea set him thinking about Elizabeth and the hopelessness of his situation with her. What had started out as a powerful attraction was clearly doomed to end in disaster. In fact, at that moment of bleakness, the apothecary could imagine no future with her at all. He sighed quietly and turned to go back to bed. But just as he did so, something moved in the street below, and turning back to the window, he gave it his full attention. It was a strange figure, dressed in a long, concealing garment, which hid the fact whether it be male or female. Yet despite this, John had the distinct impression that he was regarding a woman. She stood motionless, gazing at the angel, not moving at all as she stared. Seized with the idea that it was she who had earlier beckoned to Rose, the apothecary threw a cloak over his nightshirt and sped downstairs. Grappling with the heavy bolts on the front door took him some time, but eventually he got it open and gazed out on Coinage Hall Street. She, or he, had gone, and though he stepped outside and looked round the place, there was no sign of the stranger. Shivering, despite the warmth of the night, John Rawlings returned to bed. True to his word, he stayed by Rose's side next day, except when she went to the water closet, but even then he remained outside the door until he heard the crank of the plunger, when he pushed the partition open and his child was restored to him. Privately, he thought it quite marvellous that a remote inn like the Angel should have had such a thing installed, it not being his experience in other places in which he had stayed. Having finished an early breakfast, John decided to take his daughter for a walk before the one item of business left to him. In the street, she turned to look at him as they left the Angel and headed up the town. "Papa, "Have you much left to do here?" "Only one thing," he answered, taking her hand and holding it fast. "Will it take long?" "No. I shall do it this morning, and then we will leave tomorrow." "Shall we catch the stagecoach?" "Yes, my darling. We will cram in with the rest of the passengers." "I look forward to that." "We can catch it to Truro, and from there make our way to Devon." "We are going to say goodbye to Mrs. Elizabeth, aren't we?" "Of course we are, sweetheart. But after that we must return to London and resume our old life." "I want to see Grandpapa again." "Do you love him?" "Very much indeed." And Rose tightened her grip on the apothecary's hand and gave him a look of such sincerity that he felt the tears sting his eyes. They walked in silence for a while, and then John's daughter said, "Oh, look, Papa, here come Mr. Sayce and Mrs. Anstey." And there, to the apothecary's utter amazement, came 2 members of the coven, strolling along as if they hadn't a care in the world. But then, he realized, nobody was aware of their secret other life, nobody except Tim Painter and himself. He decided to behave as if he knew nothing. "Mrs. Anstey, Mr. Sayce," he said, and swept off his hat. Beside him, he felt Rose give a small curtsy as she had been taught. Today, the older man looked decidedly deflated, John thought, though the woman stared at the apothecary as lecherously as ever. "Mr. Rawlings, we were just talking about you." And Anne ran her oddly small tongue over her lips in a manner that John could only think of as obscene. "Really? What were you saying?" "That we hadn't seen you since that night in Redruth when we played cards." "I've been quite busy," he answered, dropping his eyes. He found it hard to return Anne Anstey's gaze, which, though strangely cold, had still an unpleasant fire in its depth. He recalled her lying stark naked on the altar, coupling with a colquite, and had to control himself not to shudder visibly. But despite his efforts, he must have made some movement, because he felt Rose glance up at him questioningly. "Hello, my dear. How pretty you look today." Mrs. Anstey was speaking to his daughter. "Thank you," and the child curtsied again. It was at that moment that the apothecary caught Sayce's eye, and briefly the expression within. To say that the man looked strained would have been an understatement. There was genuine fear in his glance. John could not help but notice that the older man's lips were forming soundless words. Anne bent down and picked up one of Rose's rich red curls. "Beautiful," she crooned. "You have such beautiful hair, sweetheart." The child pulled back against John's legs. "Thank you," she whispered again, but the apothecary could tell that she was genuinely frightened. He bowed abruptly. "I'm sorry. I have an urgent appointment. Come, Rose." And replacing his hat, he hurried up the road. "I didn't like it when the woman touched my hair," the child said quietly. "It wasn't she who came to your room, was it?" "No, Papa. It was somebody much thinner and older." "I wonder," he said to himself, as into his brain came a picture of the unappealing features of Mrs. Legassick. Returning to the Angel, he discovered the coaches in which Mrs. Pill had arrived drawn up outside. Now he knew that he had little time. His problem was going to be what to do with Rose, for what he had to say was not suitable for her ears. Eventually, he found the thumb-sucking fat maid and asked her if Rose could stay with her for half an hour. On the production of a coin, the girl rapidly agreed. "You are not to leave her alone, you understand?" "Oh, I won't, sir, I promise. Not even for a second. No, sir." He went downstairs and eventually found Tim Painter taking his ease in the parlour. "Aren't you leaving?" John asked in some surprise. "No," Tim answered lazily. "Thought I'd stay and give what assistance I could to hunting down these wretched witchcraft people. I mean to say, one can't have this sort of thing going on in decent society." If he had not been about such serious business, John would have laughed uproariously. How a reprobate such as Tim could have the barefaced gall to sit and pontificate about moral standards was almost beyond him. As it was, he grinned broadly. "Glad you'll be with us," he said. "Think nothing of it, dear boy." And Tim flapped a languid hand. "Have you told Mrs. Pill?" asked John. "Yes. I said I would follow on later." "And how did she take that?" "Not well. Not well. However, the wretched Jasper came to the rescue and said it would be a much easier journey without me. For once I was totally in agreement with him." The apothecary shook his head. "Why do you really want to stay?" Tim shifted in his seat. "I don't know exactly. I think it was the thought that I might, at last, be of some help. Which reminds me, why did you really call us all together last night?" John's face remained impassive. "Because I would have present the 4 men who visited Diana Warwick on that fatal night. I wanted to run through the sequence of events with you all for the last time, but it's too late for that now." "What do you mean?" "I'll explain later." The apothecary stood up. "Do you know where I'll find Mrs. Pill and Jasper?" "They're in the hall somewhere, I think, but you'd better hurry. They'll be leaving shortly." "Thank you." They were indeed getting ready for departure, though Mrs. Pill, looking terribly white and thin, had taken a seat in a snug, leaving Jasper to organize the servants getting the trunks onto the 2 carriages. Catching her alone, John sat down beside her. "So, you're departing from us, madam?" "Yes," she said, and her voice sounded broken and fragile. "I realize there is no hope for my poor Isabel, so I'm taking my leave of this accursed place." John nodded. "I quite understand how you feel. Helstone can hold nothing but unhappy memories for you." She lowered her head, staring into her lap. "I shall think of it as the town in which my heart was broken." "And not just because of Isabel," he said quietly. She looked up, and just for a second he peered into those small, sad eyes, today partly hidden by a pair of spectacles. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I think perhaps you know." "I don't understand what you're talking about." "I speak of the death of Diana Warwick," he said, still in that calm, quiet voice. "What about it?" Leaning over, John took one of her thin-fingered hands in his. "Why don't you tell me what happened? It would be much easier if you did." End of Side 14.